The seashell came first. I was 7, standing in the cold Atlantic water that made my feet ache and turn pink, the waves pulling sand from beneath my toes with each retreat. The beach was littered with broken shells, fragments of what had once been homes, but this one was different. Perfect, complete, a spiral that wound inward toward some mathematical center I couldn't name but could feel in my chest. When I held it to my ear, my grandmother's voice behind me said, "You can hear the ocean." But that wasn't what I heard. I heard something older, more patient. I heard the sound of time itself, the slow revolution of growing things, the whisper of patterns that governed everything from galaxies to the chambers of my own heart. The Geodiscovery happened at a garage sale on Elm Street, 3 blocks from our house. 50 cents for what looked like a lump of ordinary rock, gray and unremarkable. My father, counting change from his wallet, muttered, "Waste of money," but handed over the quarters anyway because it was 50 cents, not $50, and because I was 8 and still young enough to want things that made no sense. In our driveway that afternoon, with the hammer he'd reluctantly retrieved from the tool shed, we cracked it open. The sound was different from what I'd expected. Not sharp but hollow, like breaking an egg made of stone. And then it split, and my father went quiet. Inside was a cathedral. Crystalline teeth jutted inward, catching the late afternoon light and throwing it back in shattered rainbows. Purple amethyst lined the hollow chamber, each crystal perfectly formed, as if some patient god had spent centuries carving a secret room inside an ordinary rock. Well, my father said, and that was all. But he carried the 2 halves inside himself, carefully, like he was carrying something fragile and newly precious. The blue jay feather came after a storm in April when I was 9. I found it pressed against the chain link fence behind our garage, brilliant blue with black bars, still perfect despite having fallen from the sky. I carried it inside between my palms, afraid to crush it, and pressed it between the pages of my journal. The journal that was already becoming something more than a diary. The feather left a faint outline on the paper, a ghost print that marked the page long after I'd moved it to a frame. To others, these were curiosities, a child's clutter, but to me, they formed a vocabulary I was slowly learning to read. Each object was a word in a sentence I was trying to understand, a language that spoke of patterns and purposes hidden just beneath the surface of things. At the dinner table, age 9, I tried to explain why the spiral in the shell meant something. My mother's face wore the expression of patient bewilderment that I would come to know well, loving but lost. My father chewed his pot roast thoughtfully, nodding as if he understood, though I could see in his eyes that he didn't. My younger brother rolled his eyes and asked if he could be excused. "It's just pretty," and my mother offered gently, "That's enough, isn't it?" But it wasn't just pretty. It was a blueprint. It was the same spiral that appeared in hurricanes viewed from space, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, in the curl of my own fingerprint. It was evidence of some fundamental grammar governing everything from the microscopic to the cosmic. And I could feel it humming just beneath my understanding, like a song played in the next room. Only my grandmother understood. She was the one who had taught me to garden, who had shown me how to read the sky for weather, how to know which plants would thrive where by watching what already grew there. In her backyard, among the tomatoes and wild columbines, she would listen to my theories with complete seriousness. "You see the world the way poets do," she said one afternoon, her hands dark with soil, "but you want to build like engineers do. That's rare." She was transplanting seedlings, each one placed with careful consideration of sun and shade, water and wind. Most people learn to see one way or the other. Scientists look for what they can measure. Artists look for what they can feel. But you want to build what you feel. That's going to be harder. She was right about the difficulty. In school, I began to understand that my way of thinking had no proper category. Art class rewarded creativity without function. Science class demanded function without poetry. When Mrs. Patterson assigned us to design a simple machine. I submitted sketches of a building with roots that could sense groundwater, shifting its foundation to seek moisture during drought. Her comment, written in careful red ink, was kind but clear. "This is creative, but the assignment was to design something practical." But practical according to what? According to whose understanding of what was possible? In my journal, its pages growing warped and thick from my pencil strokes, I drew machines that weren't cold and hard, but alive. I sketched a water-pumping system that worked like a human heart, with chambers that contracted and expanded in steady rhythm. I designed filters that mimicked the branching veins of leaves, channeling water through increasingly fine passages until it emerged clean. I imagined buildings that grew from the ground like trees, their foundations spreading wide and deep, their walls breathing with the seasons. I didn't know the word biomimicry yet. I didn't know that what I was doing had a name, that there were others scattered around the world who looked at nature and saw not just beauty but instruction. I only knew that the wind taught lessons about aerodynamics, that water carved the most efficient paths through stone, that bone was stronger than steel when you considered weight, strength ratios, and that everything I needed to know about engineering was already written in the world around me. It was a philosophy before it was a methodology. It was the belief that the best solutions weren't invented, but discovered, that they were already here, in the spiral of the shell and the structure of the feather, waiting to be heard by someone who remembered how to listen. The science fair announcement went up in October of my 7th grade year, pinned to the bulletin board outside the library with red thumbtacks. "Young scientists change the world," the header proclaimed in bold letters. Below, in smaller text, the requirements: identify a problem, propose a solution, build a working model. I stared at that flyer for a long time, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, other students flowing around me like water around a stone. Change the world. The words seemed to pulse with possibility. This wasn't Mrs. Patterson's assignment to build something practical. This was permission to dream something real. 3 weeks before the fair, I had settled on my project, a water purification system inspired by the lotus flower. I had discovered the lotus effect during a late night dive through research papers online, my eyes burning from the blue glow of the computer screen. The lotus leaf, I learned, was a marvel of natural engineering. Its surface was covered with microscopic bumps coated in waxy crystals, creating a structure that repelled not just water but contaminants. Water beaded and rolled off, carrying dirt and bacteria with it. The leaf cleaned itself simply by existing. I watched YouTube videos of water droplets on lotus leaves, playing them in slow motion, mesmerized by the perfect spheres that rolled across the surface like mercury across glass. If I could replicate that structure, I thought, I could create filters that wouldn't clog, purification systems that maintained themselves. The building began in our garage. My father, with the resigned generosity of a parent who loved me more than he understood me, helped me clear a workspace among the lawn mower and paint cans. The smell of hot glue became the perfume of my obsession. I melted fingertips on the glue gun, burned my thumb with the soldering iron, spent afternoons at the public library using their 3D printer after convincing Mrs. Rodriguez, the skeptical head librarian, that this was legitimate research. Mrs. Rodriguez initially regarded my project with the wariness of someone who'd seen too many students with grand plans and shallow commitment. "You want a print. What exactly?" she asked, squinting at my hand. "Braun Designs." "Microscopic surface patterns," I explained, spreading my sketches across her desk, based on lotus leaf structure, for water purification. Her expression softened slightly. "And you think this will work?" "I think it might," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. She studied my drawings for a long moment, then nodded. 2 hours a day maximum, and you clean up after yourself. Those became my favorite hours. The 3D printer hummed with mechanical patience, building my designs layer by microscopic layer while Mrs. Rodriguez worked quietly at her desk, occasionally glancing over to check my progress. Sometimes she'd ask questions, real questions, not the patronizing kind adults usually ask children about their projects. She wanted to know how the filter would handle different water sources, whether the self-cleaning mechanism would work with industrial pollutants, how I planned to scale the design. I didn't have good answers to most of her questions, but I loved that she asked them. They made the project feel serious, important, like something that belonged in the world beyond the science fair. The night before the fair, I couldn't sleep. My model sat on my desk, illuminated by the lamp I'd left on. A transparent chamber fitted with my 3D printed Lotus-inspired filters connected to a small pump powered by a 9-volt battery. It looked organic and strange, all curves and flowing lines, nothing like the geometric precision of conventional filtration systems. It looked like something that might have grown rather than been built. I lay in bed rehearsing my presentation, running through the explanation of surface tension and hydrophobic materials, practicing the demonstration where I would pour muddy water into the top and watch clean water flow from the bottom. My mother had helped me attach the project label earlier that evening, her fingers more steady than mine with the double-sided tape. "I don't understand it," she had admitted, smoothing down the corners of the label, "but I see how much you care. That counts for something." The science fair morning arrived gray and cold. The gymnasium had been transformed overnight into a maze of folding tables covered with white paper, each station marked with numbers that corresponded to a list of participants. I found my assigned spot, table 47, between the periodic table display and a project about battery life in different temperatures. Around me, other projects gleamed with professional polish. The potato battery at table 46 had neat laminated labels and perfectly aligned wires. The volcano across the aisle boasted a professionally printed poster board with charts and graphs that looked like they'd come from a textbook. The solar system model near the entrance had been crafted with mathematical precision. Each planet painted in accurate colors and scaled to proper proportions. My Lotus filter looked like something from another world entirely. As I set it up on the table, arranging the containers of test water and clean collection vessels, I felt a curious mixture of pride and fear. It was beautiful in its strangeness, elegant in its curves, but it stood out like a wild flower in a garden of cultivated roses. The judging began at 9 o'clock. 2 adults approached my table first, a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, and a man with a clipboard who seemed to be moving through the gymnasium with the efficiency of someone checking items off a to-do list. The woman asked real questions. She wanted to know about the Lotus effect, about the microscopic structures I'd tried to replicate, about the potential applications for water purification in areas without access to clean drinking water. Her interest felt authentic, her nods encouraging. She watched the demonstration with careful attention, making notes on a small pad as clean water flowed into the collection vial. The man with the clipboard glanced at his watch, checked boxes on his evaluation form, and asked perfunctory questions about materials, cost, and manufacturing feasibility. Questions I couldn't answer with any authority because I was 13 and had never manufactured anything beyond this single prototype. After they left, I felt cautiously optimistic. The woman had seemed impressed, had even said the word innovative. Maybe strange wasn't the same as wrong. Maybe different could still be good. Then they came, the group of older students I'd noticed near the entrance, clustered around a robotics project that moved with mechanical precision. They were high school aged, too old to be competitors, probably here as volunteers or because a teacher had required attendance. They moved through the gymnasium with the casual authority of those who belonged. commenting on projects with the easy superiority of experience. I remember their laughter wasn't loud or cruel. It was worse than that. It was the low, dismissive chuckle of absolute certainty, the sound of people who knew without question that they were right and I was not. One of them, a boy with a face I've long forgotten but a tone that still lives in my memory, gestured at my model. "You think you can solve a real problem by copying a flower?" He said, not even to me, but to his friends, as if I and my dream were merely an amusing exhibit. "That's cute. My dad's an engineer. He says real innovation is about power efficiency, not poetry." The word poetry came out like something distasteful, something to be spit out rather than savored. As they turned to leave, still chuckling among themselves, an elbow caught the edge of my table. The model wobbled. The delicate, petal-shaped filter, the heart of the whole system, the piece that had taken me 6 attempts to print correctly, snapped off and skittered across the linoleum floor. The sound it made was so small. A tiny, definitive crack that somehow contained the weight of everything I'd hoped for. They didn't look back. Why would they? They had delivered their verdict and moved on, leaving me to kneel on the gymnasium floor, picking up the broken piece with hands that had begun to shake. Other students were staring now, not with malice, but with the uncomfortable fascination people have for accidents and embarrassments. A girl from the table next to mine, Sarah, I think her name was, came over after the older students had moved on. "I think it's cool," she said, but her voice carried the uncertain tone of someone offering comfort, not enthusiasm. It was pity wearing the mask of support, and somehow that felt worse than the laughter. I tried to reattach the broken filter with trembling hands and a small tube of superglue from my supply box, but it was like trying to perform surgery in an earthquake. The piece that had been elegant and purposeful now looked crooked and fragile, held together by visible adhesive and hope. The winner announcements came at noon. I stood at the back of the gathered crowd, still holding the broken filter piece in my pocket like a talisman of failure. The judges praised the winning projects for their practical applications and real-world relevance. That word, practical, seemed to echo from the walls like a judgment. The walk to the parking lot felt endless. My mother was waiting by our car, and I could see the hopeful expectation in her face transform into concern as she read my expression. "How did it go?" she asked gently. "Fine," I said, but my voice cracked on the word like ice breaking under too much weight. The car ride home passed in silence. I stared out the window at the suburban landscape sliding past, houses with perfect lawns, mailboxes aligned like soldiers, everything neat and orderly and comprehensible. I still held the broken filter piece in my palm, feeling its sharp edges, the place where my dream had cracked under the weight of their certainty. That night, I put everything in a cardboard box. The model, the research papers I'd printed, the journal pages of sketches and calculations. I closed the journal and felt the weight of that closing. Not just the physical weight of the cover against the pages, but the spiritual weight of giving up, of letting their laughter become the final word. The box went to the back of my closet, behind outgrown clothes and forgotten toys, and I tried to pretend it wasn't there. For a long time, I tried to amputate that part of myself. I put the seashell and the geode in the same box with the broken water filter. I closed the journal and shoved it to the back of a drawer. I tried to think in straight lines. I tried to want normal things. I tried to learn the language of power and efficiency. Freshman year of high school arrived like a second chance I hadn't asked for. I enrolled in normal classes: algebra, biology, English literature, world history. Subjects with clear boundaries and established answers. I joined normal clubs. Student council, I lasted 3 meetings. Debate team, my arguments were too philosophical, not strategic enough. Photography club, but even there, I found myself drawn to patterns in tree bark and water ripples. images that made other members uncomfortable with their lack of obvious subjects. In the cafeteria, I sat alone most days, watching groups with the careful attention of an anthropologist studying foreign customs. There were the athletes, easy to identify by their leather jackets and confident postures. The theater kids, dramatic and loud, their conversations filled with references I didn't understand. The honor students, bent over homework even during lunch, their futures as carefully planned as their class schedules. I tried to crack the code of belonging. I observed how they laughed, not at what was genuinely funny, but at what was expected to be funny. I watched how they dressed, spoke, moved through the hallways with the unconscious assurance of those who knew their place in the social ecosystem. I practiced their mannerisms in the bathroom mirror, trying to teach my face expressions that didn't come naturally. For a brief, miserable period during my sophomore year, I achieved a kind of provisional acceptance among a group of popular students. It happened by accident. I'd helped Jessica Morrison with her biology homework, explaining photosynthesis in a way that finally made sense to her. She was grateful, and gratitude from Jessica Morrison was a form of social currency I hadn't known I could earn. Suddenly, I was invited to sit at their table, to join their conversations, to laugh at their jokes even when they weren't funny. Especially when they weren't funny. I learned to pretend interest in things that bored my soul. Celebrity gossip, fashion trends, the complex social dynamics of who was dating whom. I nodded and smiled and offered opinions about things I didn't care about, feeling like an actor who'd forgotten she was performing. The betrayal when it came was swift and surgical. Somehow they found the old journal. I never figured out how, whether I'd left it visible during a study session or someone had gone through my belongings looking for something else. But one Monday morning, I arrived at school to find photocopies of my sketches circulating among their group like evidence of some crime I'd committed. "Remember when you thought flowers could clean water?" Jessica said, holding up a copy of my lotus filter design, her voice carrying the same dismissive amusement I'd heard at the science fair. The others laughed, and I realized that my brief membership in their world had been provisional all along, subject to revocation the moment they discovered who I really was. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the seashell still sitting on my shelf like an accusation. I wanted to throw it away, to complete the amputation I'd begun, but I couldn't make my hands do it. It sat there in the darkness, a small spiral shadow against the wall, holding its secrets and my abandoned dreams with equal silence. The depression crept in like fog, so gradually I didn't notice it until I was completely surrounded. I began sleeping through alarms, missing first period, then second. My grades, which had always been my reliable source of approval, started to slip. Math homework went undone. History essays were submitted late or not at all. My mother, worry lines deepening around her eyes, suggested I might want to talk to someone. The school counselor, Mr. Williams, had kind eyes and a patient manner that made me want to trust him. His office smelled like coffee and contained a collection of inspirational posters that probably helped other students, but made me feel more isolated in my inability to be inspired. "What do you enjoy?" he asked during our first session, leaning back in his chair with the practiced casualness of someone trained to seem unthreatening. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one. What did I enjoy? I had enjoyed dreaming impossible machines and sketching patterns that existed in both flowers and hurricanes, but that person felt like someone I'd known a long time ago, in a different life. "I don't know," I said, and heard how hollow my voice sounded, like an echo in an empty room. The suffocation wasn't metaphorical. It was physical, a tightness in my chest that made breathing conscious work instead of automatic reflex. Everything looked gray, as if someone had placed a filter over the world that drained color and meaning from even the most beautiful things. Food lost flavor, music became noise, sleep offered no rest, and waking brought no energy. I was living a life of self-imposed exile anyway, I realized. Just from myself instead of from them. The tragedy wasn't their laughter. It was my own silence that followed. The moment of clarity came during biology class in the spring of my junior year. Mrs. Henderson was teaching about evolution, natural selection, the survival strategies that had allowed different species to thrive in their environments. She clicked through slides showing adaptations, the long neck of the giraffe, the camouflage of the stick insect, the echolocation of bats. Nature is the most efficient engineer, she said, advancing to a slide that showed the honeycomb structure of beehives. Every form follows function. Every solution has been tested by millions of years of trial and error. Something stirred in my chest, a feeling so long dormant I'd almost forgotten its name. It was recognition, resonance, the echo of a voice I'd been trying not to hear for 3 years. I looked around the classroom at my fellow students, most of them half asleep or focused on their phones, and realized that what Mrs. Henderson was describing was exactly what I'd been trying to understand with my seashells and geodes and journal sketches. I'd been right. Not practically right, perhaps not immediately applicable, but fundamentally, philosophically right. Nature was an engineer, and I'd been trying to learn its language before I even knew that language had a name. The afternoon was gray and cold, early November rain tapping against windows with the persistence of someone asking to be let in. I went to the library not for school, not for research, but out of a kind of desperate, lonely hunger I couldn't name. The public library had become my refuge during these years of attempted normalcy, a place where I could sit without anyone expecting me to be anything other than quiet. I wandered aimlessly through the stacks, running my fingers along book spines like reading Braille. Fiction, history, science, philosophy. The philosophy section was tucked into a corner near the back, dusty and poorly lit, the kind of place where books went to be forgotten. I'd never spent much time there before. Philosophy seemed like something for people who wanted to think about thinking instead of actually doing anything. But that afternoon, maybe because the rain made everything feel suspended and strange, I found myself pulled to those shelves. The titles were mostly meaningless to me: Critique of Pure Reason, Being and Time, The Phenomenology of Perception. Then one spine caught my eye, not because I understood it, but because something in the arrangement of words seemed important. The Wound and the Bow, by Edmund Wilson. I pulled it from the shelf and opened it randomly, the way people used to open Bibles looking for divine guidance. The page I landed on was discussing the Greek myth of Philoctetes, the archer with the festering, incurable wound, who was abandoned on a desert island because his pain and smell made him unbearable to his companions. But his bow was magic, and eventually they needed him to win the Trojan War, wound and all. Wilson's thesis was simple and revolutionary. The wound is the source of the gift. I sat down right there on the library floor, rain drumming against the windows, and read those words again and again. The wound is the source of the gift. The thing that makes you unbearable to others is the same thing that makes you irreplaceable. The pain that isolates you is the pain that creates your unique vision, your particular way of seeing and solving and building. The words rearranged something fundamental inside me, like tectonic plates shifting to create new landscape. My wound was the laughter, the feeling of being an outsider, of seeing connections others dismissed as meaningless or impractical. But what if that wasn't a flaw to be hidden? What if that was exactly what the world needed? Mrs. Chen found me there 20 minutes later, still sitting on the floor with the book open in my lap, probably looking like I'd been struck by lightning. "You okay, honey?" she asked, crouching down with the careful grace of someone whose knees weren't as young as they used to be. Mrs. Chen was the head librarian, a woman in her 60s who'd always treated me with the gentle courtesy she showed all the library's regular visitors. I'd never really talked to her beyond the basic pleasantries of checking out books, but something about finding me sitting on the floor seemed to open a door between us. "I think so," I said, holding up the book. "Maybe for the first time in a while." She glanced at the title and smiled. Edmund Wilson. That's heavy reading for someone your age. It's about wounds, I said, which probably sounded strange but was the most accurate way I could describe what I'd discovered. The best books usually are, she said, settling more comfortably on the floor beside me, her back against the bookshelf. Mind if I ask what kind of wound you're carrying around? So I told her. About the science fair, about the laughter, about the years I'd spent trying to cut away the parts of myself that dreamed in spirals and saw machines in flowers. I told her about feeling like an alien in my own life, about the gray filter that had settled over everything, about forgetting what I used to love. She listened without judgment, the way librarians are trained to listen, with patient attention and no agenda beyond understanding. I wanted to be an artist when I was your age, she said when I finished. Painter specifically. I was going to create beautiful things and change the world through beauty, but my parents wanted stability, security. Teaching seemed like a compromise. Summers off, steady paycheck, respectability. Then I discovered I wasn't a very good teacher. Kids made me nervous, so I became a librarian instead. She gestured around us at the quiet stacks, the carefully organized knowledge. I thought I'd given up on art entirely, but you know what I discovered. I bring art into everything I do. The way I arrange displays, the books I choose to highlight, the programs I create. I find ways to make this place beautiful, to help people discover things that will change their lives. There are many ways to honor what you love. Her words were kind, meant to comfort, but they sparked something like panic in my chest. I didn't want to honor my dreams from a distance. I didn't want to find ways to make peace with having given up. I wanted to be the thing I dreamed of being, not just to remember it fondly while doing something else. But what if you didn't want to honor it? I asked. What if you wanted to be it? She studied my face carefully, and I could see her recalculating, understanding that I wasn't looking for comfort but for permission. Then you'd better stop sitting on the floor of the philosophy section and start figuring out how to build whatever it is you're meant to build, she said. I checked out The Wound and the Bow that day, along with 3 books on biomimicry, 2 on engineering design, and 1 on the mathematics of natural patterns. Mrs. Chen didn't say anything about the odd combination, just stamped them all with the same careful efficiency. Walking home in the rain, I didn't bother with an umbrella or hood. The water soaked through my jacket and into my hair, and I didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, I felt awake. The box in my closet, it was calling to me, not with the voice of regret, but with the voice of possibility. I went home that day, and I took the journal out of the drawer. Actually, first I took the entire box out of the closet, carried it downstairs to the kitchen table, and sat staring at it for an hour like it might contain either treasure or explosives, which, in a way, it did. Opening the box released the smell of old paper and dust, but underneath that was something else. The faint scent of hot glue and optimism, the ghost of the 13-year old who'd believed she could change the world by copying a flower. The seashell was still perfect, its spiral as mathematically precise as it had been the day I found it on the beach. The geode still held its cathedral of amethyst teeth, catching the kitchen light and throwing it back in tiny rainbows. The blue jay feather had faded but remained intact, pressed between journal pages like a pressed flower, and the journal itself, thick with drawings and dreams, warped from years in the box, but somehow still alive with possibility. I flipped through the pages slowly, seeing my 10-year-old handwriting, the careful sketches of machines that breathed and filters that grew and buildings that adapted. The hope in those drawings was almost unbearable to look at. So pure, so unguarded, so convinced that being right was enough to make something true in the world. Tucked between 2 pages near the back, I found something I'd forgotten, a note from my grandmother, written in her careful script on a piece of stationery with violets in the corner. I must have put it there after her funeral during that terrible sophomore year when everything felt like it was falling apart. Don't let them make you small. It said just that, 5 words in faded blue ink, but they hit me like a physical blow. I cried then, for the first time in months. Not the bitter tears of frustration or the hollow tears of depression, but something deeper and more cleansing. I cried for the time I'd lost, for the dreams I'd abandoned, for the girl who'd believed in spirals and patterns and the secret language of growing things. I cried because she'd been right, and I'd let them convince me she was wrong. But mostly I cried with relief, because I could feel her stirring inside me again, that girl with dirt under her fingernails and impossible blueprints in her head. She'd been waiting all this time, patient as a seed in winter soil, ready to grow again when conditions were right. The decision felt physical. A straightening of my spine, a yes in my blood, a door opening in my chest that I'd kept locked for 3 years. If my way of seeing was a flaw, then I would become a master of that flaw. If my language was one they couldn't understand, I would build a world so compelling they would have to learn it. That night, I opened a fresh journal to the first page and wrote at the top, Water from Air, Namib Beetle Project V1, 0. Below that, I sketched my first design in 3 years, clumsy and uncertain, my hand out of practice, but alive with intention. The dream wasn't dead. It had just been sleeping, waiting for me to remember who I was meant to be. This is where the dream stopped being a fantasy and started becoming a reality. And the becoming, that was the real work. It was a brutal, beautiful, and deeply lonely alchemy. The dream in my head was pure, perfect, brilliant. Translating it into the physical world was a war of attrition against my own limitations, against the laws of physics, against the sheer, grinding weight of reality. I started with Python. Not because I loved coding, but because I needed to love it, needed to make the computer speak the language of my machines. I followed online tutorials at midnight, my desk lamp creating a pool of yellow light in the darkness while the rest of the house slept. The first time I successfully printed Hello World to the screen, it felt like magic. Like I'd taught the machine to speak, but coding wasn't poetry. It was ruthlessly logical, demanding precision I'd never had to cultivate. A missing semicolon could crash hours of work. A misplaced bracket could turn elegant code into incomprehensible gibberish. I spent 2 hours one night hunting for a single missing colon, staring at lines of text until my eyes burned, feeling like I was trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach. When I finally found it, hidden in line 47 of a 200-line program, the rush of victory was intoxicating. The code ran, executed flawlessly, performed exactly the calculation I'd designed it to perform. I'd bent the machine to my will through pure persistence and careful attention to detail. Next came CAD Software computer-aided design, the tool that would let me build my dreams in 3 dimensions before trying to make them real. I watched YouTube tutorials from engineers in other countries, following along as they manipulated virtual objects with casual expertise. Slowly, I learned to think in 3D space, to rotate and extrude and Boolean my way toward designs that might actually work. The first prototype was inspired by the Namib desert beetle, a creature that survived in one of the world's driest places by harvesting water from fog. Its shell was covered with alternating patches of hydrophobic and hydrophilic surfaces, areas that repelled water and areas that attracted it. Fog condensed on the hydrophilic patches and was channeled toward the beetle's mouth by the hydrophobic areas. It was evolution's solution to the problem of creating water from nothing but air and patience. My first attempt was laughably crude, a small chamber based on what I understood of the beetle's shell structure, with carefully designed surfaces that should have encouraged condensation. I 3D printed the components at the library, Mrs. Rodriguez watching with barely concealed skepticism as the printer slowly built my dreams layer by layer. It ran for 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, it produced exactly 2 drops of water and filled the garage with the acrid smell of burning electronics. The motor I'd salvaged from an old computer fan wasn't designed for continuous operation, and the power supply I'd cobbled together from spare parts had all the reliability of a house of cards in a windstorm. Version 2.0 leaked. The seals I designed looked perfect on screen, but couldn't withstand actual water pressure. Version 3.0 produced condensation beautifully, but couldn't collect it. The water formed on my biomimetic surfaces and then just sat there, mocking me. Version 4.0 actually collected water, but it was contaminated with plastic particles and manufacturing residue, turning what should have been pure water into a cloudy, bitter-tasting failure. Version 5.0 seemed perfect until I tried to run it for more than an hour. The battery died, the motor overheated, and several crucial components warped from the heat they generated. I was learning that engineering wasn't just about having good ideas. It was about understanding the complex interactions between materials, forces, temperatures, and time. The 3 a.m. moments were the worst. Sitting in the garage workshop, my father had finally conceded to me, surrounded by the corpses of failed prototypes. I would hear the ghost voice from the science fair. You think you can solve a real problem by copying a flower? Watch this. I would say out loud to the empty garage, my voice hoarse from exhaustion, but still defiant. The breakthrough came from a research paper I found at 2:30 a.m. during one of my insomniac deep dives into academic databases. A team in Switzerland had successfully printed nanostructured surfaces that mimicked not just the beetle's water collection strategy, but the self-cleaning properties of lotus leaves. The surface patterns were incredibly complex, requiring precision at the microscopic level, but they worked exactly as nature had designed them to work millions of years ago. I spent my savings on a higher-resolution 3D printer capable of producing the detailed surface textures I needed. When the first nanostructured component came off the print bed, it looked like ordinary plastic, but under a magnifying glass, its surface was covered with tiny pillars and valleys that perfectly replicated the Swiss team's design. I held my breath as I tested it. Water beaded and rolled across the surface exactly as it should, carrying dust and contaminants with it. The surface cleaned itself simply by existing, just like the lotus leaf that had started this entire journey years ago. Small victories began to accumulate. My first full cup of water, though it took 6 hours to produce. My first continuous hour of operation without component failure. My first clean water test that showed no contamination, no plastic particles, nothing but pure H2O extracted from ambient air. The isolation was complete by then. Friends from school had stopped calling, stopped inviting me to parties I wouldn't have attended anyway. Weekends were spent alone in the garage, eating sandwiches at my workbench, falling asleep over circuit diagrams and thermal calculations. But the loneliness felt different now, not like exile but like chosen solitude, the necessary sacrifice of someone building something that mattered. There was a moment during my senior year when I almost gave up. I'd been scrolling through social media and saw updates from former classmates. College acceptances, internships at prestigious companies, normal teenage milestones I'd traded for countless hours alone with machines that barely worked. Jessica Morrison had gotten into Stanford. The boy from the science fair was heading to MIT on a robotics scholarship. What was I doing? What did I have to show for 4 years of isolation and obsession? My mother found me that night, sitting in the garage at 2 a.m. with my head in my hands, surrounded by the evidence of my stubborn dreams. She brought tea and didn't say anything, just sat on an overturned bucket beside my workbench and waited. I don't know if this matters. I finally said, I can't tell you if it matters to the world. She said, stirring honey into her cup, but I can tell you it matters to you, and that's where all the important things start. She was right. Somewhere, during those years of failing and rebuilding, the boundaries between myself and my work had dissolved completely. I ate at the workbench, surrounded by circuit diagrams and thermal calculations. I dreamed in 3D models, my sleeping brain rotating and extruding virtual components. I thought in Python loops, breaking complex problems into smaller, manageable functions. I was no longer just a girl with a dream. I was an engineer, a coder, a designer, a philosopher of machines. I had become my own collaborator, my own most demanding critic, and my own most steadfast believer. The loneliness began to recede, not because people appeared, but because I was no longer alone with myself. Version 23. Zero sat on my workbench like a prayer made physical. It was late November, cold enough in the garage that I could see my breath, the space heater running constantly, but never quite managing to warm the concrete floor. The machine no longer looked clumsy or cobbled. Together, 4 years of iteration had refined it into something elegant and purpose. Full layers of biomimetic surfaces catching light like scales. An efficient motor that ran whisper. Quiet, smart sensors that monitored humidity and temperature and adjusted the collection process accordingly. It was beautiful, and I was terrified to turn it on. I'd been here before, the moment of truth that preceded either breakthrough or another expensive lesson in failure. But this time felt different. This time, everything I'd learned was integrated into a single system that looked less like a machine and more like something that had grown, evolved, emerged from the desert itself to harvest water from impossible air. Before flipping the switch, I said a prayer not to God, but to the 10-year-old girl who'd first held a seashell to her ear and heard the whisper of patterns governing everything from spiral galaxies to the chambers of the heart. I did this for you. I whispered to the empty garage. The switch clicked with the same small sound that had launched 1,000 failures. But this time, the hum that followed was different. Not the labored whine of overtaxed components or the irregular stutter of systems fighting themselves, but a low, resonant frequency that seemed to harmonize with something fundamental in the universe. It was the sound of perfect engineering, of function following form following function in an endless loop of efficiency. I felt it in my chest, that hum, a vibration that resonated with my ribs, my heartbeat, the very bones that held me upright. It was the sound of my internal language finally being spoken back to me by the universe itself. Condensation began forming within minutes. Tiny water droplets appeared on the nanostructured surfaces like morning dew. But instead of just sitting there mocking me as they had in previous versions, they began to move. The hydrophobic channels guided them toward collection points, with the patient inevitability of water finding its way downhill. Drop by drop, they merged and flowed through increasingly sophisticated passages until clean water began to drip into the collection vial. I picked up the vial and held it to the garage light. Perfectly clear, no cloudiness, no particles, no evidence of the complex engineering that had extracted it from nothing but ambient air and an idea that had started with a desert beetle's shell. I tasted it. Pure water, nothing but H2O, clean and sweet and impossible. It tasted like victory. I sat down on the concrete floor, leaning against the workbench, and watched it work. The machine hummed its perfect song, condensation formed and flowed with mechanical patience, and clean water accumulated drop by precious drop. I lost track of time, mesmerized by the sight of my dreams made manifest, my language finally translated into something the world could understand. The sun was coming up through the small garage window when my father found me there, still sitting on the floor, still watching the machine work its quiet magic. He looked at the device, at the vial of water, at my face glowing with exhausted triumph. "I don't understand how it works," he said finally, his voice soft with wonder, "but I'm proud of you." The first person I called was Mrs. Chen. Even at 7 a.m., her voice was alert and warm, and when I told her what had happened, stammering with exhaustion and excitement, she listened with the patient attention that had saved my life 4 years earlier. "Congratulations," she said when I finished, You've become who you were meant to be. In that moment, sitting on the garage floor with a machine that made water from air humming beside me, I realized something profound. The laughter from the science fair didn't matter anymore. It hadn't mattered for a long time, probably since the night I decided to become a master of my own wounds instead of a victim of others' certainty. I'd been too busy building to listen to ghosts. The Maker Faire was different from the science fair in every way that mattered. Instead of a gymnasium full of nervous children and skeptical judges, it was a warehouse full of adults who built impossible things for the sheer joy of building them. Engineers and artists and inventors and dreamers, all gathered to share their creations with people who understood that the world was full of problems waiting for someone stubborn enough to solve them. I set up my booth on a Saturday morning in March, my hands steady and sure in a way they'd never been at 13. The water generator, now sleek and portable, refined through 23 iterations of failure and learning, sat on the table like a beautiful piece of sculpture that happened to produce miracles. The crowd that gathered was different too. They asked real questions, technical questions, questions about scalability and manufacturing and potential applications I hadn't even considered. An electrical engineer wanted to know about power consumption. A materials scientist was fascinated by the nanostructured surfaces. A computer programmer was curious about the sensor array and feedback systems. But it was Dr. Sarah Ackhofer who changed everything. She approached my booth in the afternoon, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the confident posture of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. She worked for Water for All, she explained, a nonprofit that brought clean water systems to communities that needed them most. How scalable is this? She asked, watching clean water flow into the collection vial with the attention of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, but hearing it from someone whose work existed in the real world, someone who dealt with actual villages and actual thirst and actual need, made it feel urgent in a new way. I think very scalable. I said, then caught myself. I know very scalable. The principles work at any size. The only limit is manufacturing complexity and cost. That conversation lasted 3 hours. Dr. Ackhofer explained the scope of water scarcity around the world. Over 2 billion people without access to clean drinking water. Entire regions where wells had failed or never existed. Communities that had to walk miles for water that wasn't even safe to drink. We need solutions that work without infrastructure, she said. No power grid, no supply chain for replacement parts, no technical expertise for maintenance. We need systems that just work reliably for years. She was describing exactly what I'd built, though I'd never thought of it in those terms. My water generator ran on solar power, used no consumable parts, required only basic maintenance, and could produce clean water anywhere the sun shone and air contained even trace amounts of humidity. We became partners that day, though the formal agreements took months to negotiate. Dr. Ackhofer had the infrastructure, the contacts, the understanding of how to turn a beautiful idea into actual impact. I had the technology and the obsessive attention to detail needed to make it work in conditions I'd never imagined. The crowdfunding campaign launched 6 months later. I'd never been good at self-promotion, but Dr. Ackhofer helped me understand that this wasn't about me anymore. It was about the communities that needed clean water and the technology that could provide it. The video we created was simple. Me explaining how the desert beetle had taught me to harvest water from air, the generator producing cup after cup of clean water, testimonials from engineers and scientists who'd tested and validated the design. It went viral in the way things go viral when they solve real problems for real people. Not because of flashy marketing or celebrity endorsements, but because clean water is one of those fundamental human needs that transcends culture and politics and geography. Everyone understands thirst. The first deployment was to a village in sub-Saharan Africa where the nearest well had failed 3 years earlier. Installing the systems was harder than I'd anticipated, not technically, but emotionally. Standing in a place where children walked 2 hours each way to collect water that might make them sick, I finally understood the true weight of what I'd built. The day we activated the first generator, a crowd gathered to watch clean water flow from a machine that looked like something from the future. The children were fascinated by the technology, but the adults understood what it meant. An end to the daily journey for water, an end to boiling and filtering and hoping, an end to the constant worry about drought and failed infrastructure. I'll never forget the video call 3 months later when the village elder showed me a young girl, maybe 8 years old, drinking water directly from the generator. Her mother stood beside her, tears in her eyes, speaking rapidly in a language I didn't understand but Dr. Okafor translated. She says her daughter has never been this healthy. No stomach problems, no sickness from bad water. She wants to know if the machine will keep working. Yes, I said and meant it. It will keep working. That was the moment I understood that dreams don't become reality for you. They become reality through you for others. The years of isolation and obsession, the failures and breakthroughs, the stubborn refusal to let other people's laughter define what was possible. All of it had been preparation for this moment when my private obsession became a public good. The awards came after that. Recognition from engineering societies, invitations to speak at conferences, articles in magazines I'd read as a teenager dreaming of changing the world. But the trophies felt distant from what mattered, which was the steady stream of emails from communities requesting water systems, each one representing people whose lives would be measurably better because I'd refused to let my dreams stay dreams. Someone posted about me online eventually, connecting my current work to an old photo from the middle school science fair. "This is the girl from that science fair," they wrote, sharing a picture of 13-year-old me standing beside the broken Lotus filter. The comments that followed were different from what I might have expected. She was ahead of her time. Vision takes courage. This is what persistence looks like. And then, years later, a private message that I almost didn't read. "I was wrong. I was cruel. I'm sorry. What you've built is remarkable." It was from him, the boy from the science fair, now a man with his own career and probably his own regrets. His face in his profile picture was older, kinder, marked by whatever experiences had taught him that cruelty toward dreams diminishes everyone involved. I wrote back, "Thank you, I forgive you, but I need you to know. I didn't build it to prove you wrong. I built it because the idea wouldn't let me go." And that was true. Revenge had never been the fuel. The fuel had been curiosity, wonder, the stubborn conviction that patterns mattered and nature knew things we hadn't learned yet. And someone needed to pay attention to the quiet wisdom written in shells and beetle shells, and the spiral dance of water finding its way home. Forgiveness, I realized, was also a kind of water, something that cleanses, that purifies, that makes growth possible in places that had been poisoned by old wounds. I forgave him not for his sake, but for mine, because holding onto that ancient laughter was like carrying around a collection of broken filters that served no purpose except to remind me of pain I'd already transformed into purpose. The world we live in, this Western culture of immediate results and viral validation, teaches us to hide our wounds, to smooth our edges, to laugh at the whimsical before it can laugh at us. It teaches us that dreams are destinations, places you arrive at rather than tools you use to build new realities. This is a lie. Dreams are not destinations. They are not even maps, really. They are compasses, pointing toward magnetic north, but requiring you to navigate the actual terrain between where you are and where you're going. The terrain is always harder than you imagined. Full of obstacles the compass can't reveal, and challenges that exist only in the space between dreaming and doing. Society sells you the mythology of overnight success, the narrative of sudden breakthrough, the story of the genius who emerges fully formed with solutions no one has ever considered. But that's not how innovation works. That's not how anything meaningful works. What you see when someone finally succeeds is the tip of an iceberg, the small visible portion supported by years of invisible work, failed experiments, discarded prototypes, 3 a.m. moments of doubt, the daily choice to continue when continuation seems pointless. The dream is a jealous companion. It demands time others give to parties, to relationships, to sleep. It asks you to choose between belonging and becoming, between the warm safety of the tribe and the cold, vast expanse of your own truth. This is the cost. No one tells you this cost before you begin paying it. They sell you the destination, not the journey's toll. We celebrate pivots and resilience in theory, in TED Talks and inspirational quotes shared on social media. But failure in the moment is not a learning opportunity. It is a humiliation. It is proof that you are exactly as foolish as they said you were, evidence that your vision was delusion and your confidence was arrogance. The alchemy that transforms failure into wisdom happens later, in retrospect, when you have the strength to reframe it. But in the crucible, while it's happening, you are simply burning. I thought I wanted them to accept me. What I actually wanted was to accept myself. Their acceptance would have been a shortcut, borrowed confidence, a way of avoiding the harder work of building my own sense of worth from the ground up. But shortcuts in matters of identity are like shortcuts in engineering. They lead to systems that look functional but collapse under stress. The wound and the bow. Philoctetes, with his festering, incurable pain, abandoned by his companions because suffering makes people uncomfortable, because wounds remind us of our own vulnerability. But his bow was magic, and eventually they needed him to win the war. The wound was not separate from the gift. It was the source of the gift, the thing that made his particular vision possible. Your wound is not your trauma. Your wound is your difference, your way of seeing that doesn't match the consensus reality, your sensitivity to patterns others dismiss as noise. The laughter you received was not really about your dream. It was about their discomfort with anything that challenged their understanding of what was possible or practical or worthwhile. But here's what they didn't understand, what I didn't understand until I'd lived it. The wound doesn't heal. It becomes something else. It becomes your strength, your particular way of solving problems no one else even sees as problems. The archer with the festering wound becomes the archer whose aim is true because pain has taught him precision. This is why we need the outcasts, the misfits, the children who see machines in flowers and hear symphonies in seashells. Not because their dreams are automatically better, but because their wounds are different, and different wounds create different gifts. The problems that keep engineers awake at night are often invisible to people who learned early how to think inside established frameworks. Innovation happens at the edges, in the spaces between disciplines, in the minds of people who never learned that certain combinations of ideas were impossible. It happens when someone who speaks the language of poetry tries to build like an engineer, when someone who thinks in spirals and patterns meets problems that require spiral, pattern-based solutions. So I sit here now in my small studio that is half office and half workshop, windows looking out at oak trees that are just beginning to turn gold with the first hint of autumn. The space smells like coffee and solder, printed plastic and possibility. My desk is organized chaos. Sketches scattered among circuit boards, a laptop displaying CD models of my current project, emails from communities requesting water systems, a cup of tea grown cold while I lost track of time designing. The shelf above my desk holds the foundational artifacts of my reality. The seashell, still perfect after all these years, its spiral as mathematically precise as the day I found it in the Atlantic waves. The geode, cracked open to reveal its cathedral of amethyst crystals, still catching light and throwing back rainbows. the blue jay feather, now mounted and framed, faded but intact, and the journal, the first journal, warped and thick with dreams and pencil strokes, displayed in a place of honor like a sacred text. But also on that shelf, never repaired, is the broken lotus filter from the science fair. I've kept it all these years as a reminder, not of failure, but of beginning, of the moment when my dream first touched the physical world and cracked under the weight of reality, teaching me that dreams and reality are not the same thing, but that one can be transformed into the other through patience and precision and the willingness to fail forward. My current journal lies open beside the laptop, its pages filled with sketches of my next project. A building that breathes like lungs, expanding and contracting with temperature changes to regulate its own climate without external energy. The design is inspired by the way tree bark expands and contracts, how bird feathers adjust to create insulation, how the human respiratory system automatically adjusts to the body's needs. My phone buzzes with an email notification. Another village in South America requesting water systems. Another problem to solve. Another opportunity to translate the language of natural patterns into solutions for human needs. This is my work now, not just building machines, but building bridges between what nature knows and what humanity needs. Looking at my old journal and new one side by side, I can see the through line of thinking that connects the 10-year-old girl with the seashell to the woman designing buildings that breathe. The handwriting is different, the understanding more sophisticated, but the fundamental approach remains the same. Observe, understand, translate, build. What was lost in becoming this person? Normal friendships, certainly. The easier path of accepted wisdom and conventional careers. The warm safety of belonging to the tribe, of having your thoughts echo the thoughts of everyone around you. I never learned the casual social skills that come from years of fitting in. Never developed the comfortable assumptions that make small talk feel natural. But what was gained? Self-trust, the deep confidence that comes from having built something meaningful from nothing but an idea, and the willingness to fail until failure becomes learning. Purpose that goes beyond personal satisfaction to actual impact in the world. The ability to speak the language the world spoke to that child listening to seashells. To translate between the wisdom of nature and the needs of humanity. Another email appears in my inbox, this one from a teenager in Ohio. They're laughing at my dream. Everyone says it won't work, that I'm wasting my time. How did you keep going when everyone said you were wrong? I start typing my response and realize it's becoming longer than an email, more like a letter, more like a story. The story of shells and geodes and feathers, of broken filters and midnight coding sessions, of the choice between belonging and becoming. The story of wounds that become gifts, of dreams that become reality not through magic, but through the alchemy of persistence and precision, and the stubborn refusal to let other people's laughter become the final word. Looking out my window, I see a bird land on the oak branch nearest my desk. Without thinking, I notice the aerodynamics of its landing, the way its feathers adjust to air currents, the efficiency of its wing design. I'm still collecting quiet things, still seeing patterns and possibilities everywhere I look. But now I know how to translate those observations into loud realities, how to build bridges between what could be and what is. The dream didn't become reality, I understand now. I became the reality the dream needed. I was the bridge between the possible and the actual, the translator between nature's language and human need. And if you are reading this, holding your own laugh at dream, you are the bridge too. The world needs translators. It needs people who speak the language of what could be and have the skills to build it into what is. Your wound is not your weakness. It is your difference, your particular way of seeing problems that others miss and solutions that others dismiss. The laughter you're hearing is not the judgment of the universe. It's the sound of people who have forgotten how to dream, trying to make you forget too. Closing, do not fear the laughter, for it is the friction that will ignite your fire. Your dream is not what you see when you close your eyes. It is what you are willing to bleed for when you open them. The world will try to prune your strange branches, but it is from the deepest, most twisted root that the strongest tree will grow. And know this somewhere, there is a child holding a seashell, hearing something no one else can hear. They will be laughed at, they will doubt, they will break. And if they are lucky, if they are stubborn, if they are brave enough to choose the cold, vast expanse of their truth over the warm, safe certainty of belonging, they will build something the world has never seen. They will make water from air. They will make the impossible ordinary. And they will do it not because someone believed in them, but because they became someone they could believe in. Your dream is waiting. Not to be dreamed, to be built,